There you go.
Hi, everyone. This is the identity first versus person first debate. In our group, we have Bradley Frias, Cami Crawford, Caroline Kim, Jasmine Franklin, and Tate Jacobson. In our first person language team, we've got Bradley Frias, Tate Jacobson, and me, Caroline Kim. In identity first language team, we have Cami Crawford and Jasmine Franklin. So there has been a long-standing controversy about the most appropriate way to identify individuals diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder with their identity or diagnosis first. For example, identifying someone as an autistic person, or person first with their diagnosis second. For an example, identifying them as person with autism. The purpose of this debate is to discuss which type of language will be the most beneficial and appropriate for the individual. The rules for debate is each side will state their points, then each side will support their points with evidence. Each side will have the chance to counter their opponent's points, followed by their own concluding points. The moderator will then conclude the debates. Each member will elaborate more on their points, and the debate should be at least 30 minutes long. So first we have Jasmine, who's going to present the identity first main points.
We have 3 main points we would like to make for identity first language. First, each individual should have the ability to decide what language is used to describe them. This decision directly affects them and describes them, so it should be their choice. Second, neurodiversity is an attribute that can be expressed in a positive manner through an individual's self-identification. An autism diagnosis is part of their identity and cannot be taken away. So identity first language encourages people to highlight the positive identification of a diagnosis. Lastly, language itself does not humanize autistic people. Humanization comes from people and their behavior towards autistic people.
Thank you, Jasmine. Now we'll have Tate, who's going to be presenting the person first main points.
Hello. I will be talking a little bit about our person first main points. First, there was a study conducted using Dutch individuals with autism to test their preference on whether or not person first language or identity first language was preferred. It was found that most of them used preferred person first language. They found that identity first language was used in a hurtful manner in the English language, which they did not wish to be associated with. Our next point is that the American Psychological Association has person first language listed as their choice of language to use in reference to individuals with mental disabilities. Our third point is that person first language was written into law in the Americans with Disability Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Both of these acts have done a lot for the disabled community, and we should use the type of language that they're suggesting. Number 4, person first language carries a certain level of importance so that an environment of dignity, respect, and hope can be maintained. By putting the person before the disability, we can help to rid society of stereotypes that have been formed. We should describe people as having a disorder and not being the disorder, so that we can positively influence the images and impressions that are formed around them.
Thank you, Tate. Now we will hear from Cami and Jasmine for our identity first evidence.
As Caroline was kind enough to say, we will begin this part of the presentation by providing the main evidence in support of the use of identity first language when discussing autistic people. For our first and possibly most important point, a study by Taboas, Dupke, and Zimmerman in 2023 surveyed autistic adults in the United States. And this study found that 87% of autistic adults in the United States prefer to identify themselves using identity first language. it seems most logical to use the language that the people we are working with prefer. In the same study, practitioners providing services to these individuals were the group that most strongly preferred the use of person-first language. And it would be disrespectful as practitioners to put our own views and feelings toward the subject over the views and feelings of the people that we're trying to represent. Secondly, the neurodiversity movement, which was created by autistic people themselves, advocates for reclaiming disability, including the use of identity-first language when referring to autistic people. As we will emphasize later, autistic is not a bad word. It is simply an important part of how these individuals experience the world. And thirdly, person-first language uses unconventional language structures to describe autistic people. Adjectives or descriptors typically come before nouns. For example, tall person or fast dog. And according to Tabois, Dupke, and Zimmerman in 2023, restructuring our normal speech patterns to describe disabled people may actually promote stigma, as it's another way that we're treating disabled people as different than able people.
In 2023, both Hanlon and Williams discussed in their article that person-first language accentuates the disability by separating it from the person as if it is something that needs to be removed. The article says autism cannot ever be separate from a person. To combat autism is to combat autistic people. The same article also reminds us that disability is vital to individuals' identity and culture, which is included in Ethics Code 1.07, Cultural Responsiveness and Diversity. Disabilities are under the umbrella of diversity and need to be considered in our language use.
And this table is just a little to add on to our evidence portion of the presentation. The table on this slide summarizes the main findings from the Berry et al. Article from 2023, which surveyed autistic Australian adults to find their most preferred language. And as you can see in the table, identity-first language was considered far more preferable than person-first language terms scored in this study. In fact, the two most offensive terms, according to the autistic people in this study, were person with ASD and person with autism, which are two of the most commonly used forms of person-first language when referencing autistic people.
Thank you. And now I will presenting on the behalf of Person First with the Person First evidence. So in the article by Louisman, Begier, and Shireen, researchers concluded that about 68% of the participants preferred the person first identification. It was mentioned that when people were identified as autistic, it had a more derogatory tone to it. And also, according to the American Psychological Association, identity first language focuses more on the diagnosis of the individual. The identity first language also suggests that the person is being defined by their diagnosis, whereas in contrast, person first language puts more emphasis on the individual rather than their diagnosis. So for an example, for an individual who has an addiction disorder, labeling the individual as an addict or an addicted individual sounds demeaning. And so using a person first language kind of eliminates that stigma around addiction and substance abuse. There's just so much more to a person than their diagnosis. And I think person first language acknowledges the individual first and their diagnosis secondary. This is a table from Buisman et al. 2022 article, which shows that the person first language was most preferred. Now we'll hear from Cami with the identity first counter.
So I will be countering the points made by members of the person first language side of the debate. So firstly, Gernsbacher in 2017 argued that person first language has a negative connotation. In analyzing the use of person-first language in scholarly writing, they found that person-first language is most often used when describing more severely disabled people, more stigmatized disabilities, and children. And adults and people with less stigmatized disabilities were more commonly referred to in scholarly literature using identity-first language. Therefore, despite the positive intentions behind it, person-first language may actually accentuate disabilities rather than drawing attention to the individual, which is its intent. Secondly, going out of the way to change our normal speech patterns and separate the person from the diagnosis might actually isolate the diagnosis and increase views that it is something negative. And as discussed earlier, we don't typically use descriptors of people or nouns in the person-first language structure. The main exceptions to this are typically things that are undesirable, like a terminal diagnosis, like person with cancer. And we use identity-first terms such as blind person or deaf person regularly. And it's not viewed as disrespectful. And like blindness or deafness, autism is not a bad word or diagnosis that needs to be separated from the individual. It's just an important aspect of how autistic people see and interact with the world. Thirdly, the Buisman and Sharon article from 2022, cited by the person-first language side of the debate, used Dutch participants. And while Dutch-speaking people may prefer to use person-first language, they speak a different language than us, and this difference could be a translation issue or connotative differences. And we found multiple studies stating that English-speaking autistic people prefer identity-first language. And as English speakers, we should keep our discussion about language use to our own language and culture that we understand, instead of trying to speak for other people. Fourth, person-first language is supposed to put the person first and essentially humanize them, which is an admirable thought. But a study by Gomez in 2018 found that the use of person-first language was not effective at this and did not change how people actually viewed autistic people. And fifth, the Berry et al. Study that I referenced earlier found that autistic people rated the terms person with ASD and person with autism as two of the most offensive terms rated in their study. And these are common person-first terms used when discussing autistic people.
Thank you, Cami. Now we will hear from Bradley, who's going to do person first counter.
All right, so I have a couple points for the person first counter. The first one is, although I agree it is imperative that individuals are called by whatever name they find appropriate, both the ETL states that the use of person first language has been shown to be substantially less offensive by members of the autism community. This is something to consider, especially when referring to an individual or even addressing an individual directly. Let us use another condition as an example. You wouldn't call someone a cancerous person, you would say they are diagnosed with cancer. The same principle can be applied to autism. Rather than call the person an autistic person, the less offensive term, according to Botha, is a person diagnosed with autism. Second point, individuals on the spectrum should have their humanity emphasized rather than their condition. Tabeos ETR states that the supporters of person first language feel that it is important to emphasize the person rather than the disorder or disability and promote the use of terms such as person with autism. It is important to highlight the person rather than the individual by stating person diagnosed with autism rather than autistic person. You are placing the importance on the fact that the individual is indeed a person who just happens to be diagnosed with autism. Point 3. The American Psychological Association states that the words that are used about autism in individuals diagnosed with autism generalize the way they are perceived. As you can imagine, this is a big deal. Individuals with autism should be spoken about with respect and be perceived as normal individuals who just so happen to be diagnosed with autism. There's a void when it comes to public knowledge with regards to autism. Person-first language helps humanize the individuals being addressed and can help others understand and relate to those individuals who are diagnosed. Point 4, the APA also states that when using person-first language, the person is emphasized as opposed to the disability or chronic condition. This is something to consider when discussing individuals with autism. As practitioners, we want to see the individual for as they are and not as a product of their diagnosis. Point 5. Although I agree to your point that separating the person from their diagnosis brings negativity about the diagnosis itself, the use of person first language isn't separating the individual from their diagnosis or attempting to hide it in any way. On the contrary, it highlights the condition, the individual who happens to be diagnosed with the condition. Point 6. According to Blaska, the use of person first language demonstrates respect for the individual and only referring to the disability as needed. It is imperative to first see them as people rather than as an affliction. The use of identity first would mention their disability whenever they were addressed. Point 7. According to Barry et al., the word autistic, as it would be in identity first language, autistic individual, conjures up negative perspectives due to misawareness from the population. Point 8. A survey conducted by Keaton et al. Found that 40% of autistic individuals in the United Kingdom did not endorse autistic and autistic person commonly used terms that are commonly used terms in identity first language.
Thank you, Bradley. And now we will hear from Jasmine for the Identity First closing statement.
As self-advocacy is becoming more common, more autistic people are expressing their preference for identity-first language. Although person-first language is the language currently being used in our professional writings, this is not the language individuals wish to be used for themselves. Their opinion should be prioritized. Secondly, separating the person from their diagnosis brings unnecessary negativity to the diagnosis itself, which is something that individuals should be proud of. Diagnoses are unique and contribute to each individual's personality and lifestyle, and we should encourage individuals to be proud of who they are.
Thank you, Jasmine. Now we'll hear from Tate, who will do person first closing statement.
Hello. Here are the 2 points that we feel can be salvaged from this debate. First, person first language remains the recommended language to use by the IDEA and the American Psychological Association. Although it may be seen as a negative connotation, highly respected associations can still be seen using this type of language. And number 2, person first language carries a certain level of importance so that an environment of dignity, respect, and hope can be maintained. If we start to put the people before the disability, we can help to rid society of stereotypes that have been formed. We should describe people as having a disorder and not being the disorder so that we can positively influence images and impressions that are formed around these people. And here is a little picture that shows some person first language and identity first language. As you can see on the left side, we have identity first, autistic, crippled, disabled people. And then on the other side, we have person first, has autism, has a disability. And next, I'll be talking a little bit about some of our ethical compliance codes and some of the ones that we found are applicable to our debate. 1.07, cultural responsiveness and diversity. Behavior analysts need to evaluate their own biases and put the needs of the individual first. If an individual has different beliefs, then the behavior analysts need to acknowledge and respect those beliefs and put their own biases aside. 1.08, which is non-discrimination. We will not discriminate based on religion, race, disability, ethnicity, or gender. We will practice diversity, equality, and inclusion in our interventions to ensure that everyone is being treated equally and respectfully. 1.10, awareness of personal bias and challenge. Behavior analysts are to be aware of their own personal biases that could affect how well they do their job. If an issue surfaces, it is up to the behavior analysts on how they're going to resolve the problem and document the actions taken. 3.01, responsibility to clients. Behavior analysts are to do what is best for their clients and to do no harm. 5.01, protecting the rights of clients, stakeholders, supervisees, and trainees. Behavior analysts protect the rights of clients, stakeholders, and supervisees and trainees, and they prioritize their clients' needs first.
Thank you, Tate. And we have a couple concluding statements. Tate is going to go over a survey that he had conducted with a team member, and then I have a couple closing statements after that. So Tate?
Yeah, so I have an individual of mine who I've been friends with since I was in the first grade, and he has autism. A few weeks ago, I was able to talk with him and sit down and talk a little bit about what identity first language was, as well as person first language. I was able to define both of them, and then he was also able to show me that he knew and understood what they were. And essentially, he's 23 years old. He's extremely intelligent. He does not require a lot of support, and he lives a very independent life with a small amount of guidance from his mother. And after talking to him a little bit about it, he said that he does not care which language people use, but he did say that the individuals should be able to choose whatever language they would prefer. And in addition to that, there are countless individuals on the spectrum lacking the vocal ability to tell us which language they want to use, and we should not be the ones to choose for them.
Thanks, Tate. It is also important to respect different cultures and languages. Some cultures might prefer identity first over person first. Additionally, some words may change meanings in translation, which could explain different preferences for identity first versus person first language between languages and cultures. Both sides make very valuable points between identity and person first language. And as professionals, we always want to make sure we are keeping our clients' best interests at heart. So if a client prefers identity first language and another prefers person first, it should ultimately be up to them to make that decision on how they would like to be identified. There isn't any harm in just asking their preference. I think it's just, we should really honor what they prefer, despite what our professional biases may be. With that said, this concludes our debate presentation. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
I did want to put our references on the screen real quick.